Picture this centuries before satellites or GPS, before steamships or even reliable maps. Ancient mariners set sail into the unknown, guided only by the stars and their unshakable courage. These were the pioneers who charted the first maritime trade routes, weaving a hidden web of connections that linked distant continents, shaped empires, and quietly built the foundation of our modern world. Think about the last time you sprinkled pepper on your meal or wrapped yourself in a soft silk scarf. Those everyday luxuries once traveled thousands of miles across treacherous seas, passed from hand to hand in a global exchange older than history itself. The truth is, we often forget how much of human progress was born on the water. While famous land routes like the Silk Road get all the glory, it was the sea that carried the heaviest burdens of trade, the boldest ideas, and the most unexpected cultural collisions. From the Phoenicians bartering purple dye along the Mediterranean to the Polynesians navigating the Pacific with nothing but the waves as their guide, these forgotten maritime highways were the original internet, a vast, living network where goods, knowledge, and traditions flowed freely. And here's the twist: many of these routes vanished from memory, erased by time, conquest, or simply the relentless march of progress. But today, we're pulling back the curtain on history's most astonishing maritime secrets. You're about to discover 21 lost trade routes that didn't just move cargo. They rewrote the rules of global economics, sparked revolutions, and even decided the fate of civilizations. How did a single monsoon wind dictate the rise and fall of kingdoms? Why did a humble spice like cinnamon become more valuable than gold? And what daring voyages connected the bustling markets of Alexandria to the remote islands of Southeast Asia? The answers lie ahead in tales of shipwrecks and survival, of cunning merchants and unsung heroes. So let's set sail together, because history isn't just found in textbooks. It's still out there, whispering in the salt-stained ruins of forgotten ports, waiting to be rediscovered. To grasp just how transformative maritime trade was for ancient civilizations, we need to step back and consider the sheer scale of what ships made possible. Picture a single merchant vessel laden with enough spices to flavor an entire empire, or bronze tools that could outfit an army cargoes unimaginable for camel caravans trudging across deserts. Water was the ultimate superhighway of the ancient world, where a ship's hull could carry the weight of kingdoms in a single voyage. But it wasn't just about volume, it was about speed. While land traders battled bandits, shifting sands, and mountain passes, sailors harnessed the wind. The monsoon winds, predictable as clockwork, became nature's autobahn, propelling ships from Rome to India in months, a journey that would take years by land. This reliability birthed empires. Take the Phoenicians, who turned tiny cedar logs into a naval empire by mastering Mediterranean currents, or the Srivijaya kingdom in Southeast Asia, which grew fat on taxes from ships threading the Malacca Strait. And then there's the hidden currency of maritime trade, ideas. Every ship carried more than silks and silver. A Greek sailor might barter olive oil in Egypt and return with papyrus, and the alphabet scribbled on it. Chinese junks sailing to East Africa didn't just bring porcelain, they brought compass technology that would later revolutionize navigation worldwide. Even religions hitched rides on trade ships, Buddhism spreading from India to Java, Islam riding Arab dhows to Zanzibar. Yet with such high stakes came ruthless competition. When Rome craved Indian pepper, entire fleets raced to corner the market. The Han Dynasty's demand for jade sparked naval rivalries in the South China Sea. And let's not forget the dark side pirates lurked from the Aegean to the Caribbean, while empires like Venice and Genoa turned trade routes into battlegrounds. Control the sea lanes, and you didn't just control wealth, you dictated history. So as we uncover these forgotten routes, remember, each wasn't just a path for goods. They were pulsating veins of civilization, where every wave carried the seeds of revolutions, alliances, and sometimes collapse. The real treasure wasn't in the cargo holds, it was in the connections they forged across the vast, indifferent sea. Imagine a color so precious that wearing it could mark you as a god among mortals, a hue worth more than its weight in silver. That was Tyrian purple, the dazzling dye that turned the Phoenicians into the undisputed merchants of the ancient Mediterranean. These seafaring pioneers didn't just trade goods, they traded power, and their secret lay in the unlikeliest of places, tiny sea snails. Thousands of mollusks were crushed to produce just a single gram of this deep, radiant purple, a process so labor-intensive that only kings, emperors, and high priests could afford it. The Phoenicians didn't stumble upon this treasure by accident. Along the rocky coasts of modern-day Lebanon, they noticed that certain shellfish oozed a liquid that, when exposed to sunlight, transformed into a color that never faded, a purple so rich it seemed to capture the very essence of royalty. They guarded this knowledge fiercely, turning their cities of Tyre and Sidon into industrial hubs where the dye was painstakingly extracted in hidden workshops. The stench of rotting shellfish was said to cling to these cities for miles, but the profits were worth it. A single pound of Tyrian purple could cost the equivalent of a Roman soldier's annual salary, making it one of history's first true luxury commodities. But the Phoenicians didn't just hoard their prized dye, they built an empire on it. Their ships, sleek and fast, became the delivery system for this liquid status symbol, weaving a trade network that stretched from the markets of Carthage to the palaces of Greece and Egypt. When Cleopatra draped herself in purple-drenched silks, or when Roman senators edged their togas with a single stripe of it, they weren't just making a fashion statement, they were flaunting their connection to a Phoenician monopoly that lasted centuries. Even the Bible took note, mentioning Tyrian purple as a symbol of wealth and divine favor. What's astonishing is how this humble mollusk trade reshaped geopolitics. The dye's astronomical value bankrolled Phoenician voyages far beyond the Mediterranean, funding expeditions that reached as far as Britain for tin and West Africa for gold. It also made them targets when Alexander the Great stormed Tyre in 332 BCE. One of his first acts was to seize control of the purple workshops, understanding that whoever controlled the dye controlled prestige itself. Yet despite wars and conquests, the secret of Tyrian purple's production vanished with the fall of Byzantium, leaving later generations to wonder how something so vibrant could simply fade from history. So the next time you see the color purple, remember, it wasn't just a shade, it was a revolution in a vat, a currency of kings, and the quiet engine behind one of antiquity's most brilliant trading empires. The Phoenicians may be gone, but their legacy still lingers in every royal robe, every stained glass window, and every modern brand that uses purple to whisper, "This is power." Now let's turn our gaze to the windswept deserts of southern Arabia, where the air itself was once thick with the scent of wealth. This was the domain of the Incense route, a sprawling network of camel caravans and coastal ships that turned the barren landscapes of Oman and Yemen into the epicenter of a trade so lucrative, it built cities of stone in the sand. Frankincense and myrrh, two resins so precious they were worth their weight in gold, weren't just commodities. They were the lifeblood of empires, the currency of gods, and the reason why even mighty Rome bowed to the merchants of the desert. Picture the journey, gnarled frankincense trees bleeding their fragrant sap under the blistering Arabian sun. Harvesters carefully scoring the bark, collecting the tears of resin that hardened into golden nuggets. These tiny treasures would then travel thousands of miles, bundled onto the backs of camels plodding through dunes or loaded onto dhows skirting the treacherous coasts of the Red Sea. Every gram was accounted for, every shipment guarded like royal treasure. Why? Because these weren't just spices, they were the sacred smoke of temples, the antiseptic balm of ancient hospitals, and the preserving magic that kept pharaohs' bodies intact for eternity. The demand was insatiable. In Egypt, priests burned frankincense to summon the favor of Ra. In Rome, emperors scattered myrrh on the floors of banquet halls to mask the scent of excess. Even the Bible immortalized these resins as gifts fit for a king, the very gifts the Magi brought to the infant Jesus. But behind the spiritual symbolism lay a ruthless economy. The Sabaean kingdom, centered in modern-day Yemen, grew staggeringly rich by monopolizing the trade, taxing every caravan that passed through their oasis cities. Their wealth built Marib, a metropolis sustained by a massive dam that turned the desert green until the dam burst, a catastrophe some say doomed the kingdom to legend. And then there were the middlemen, the Nabateans, nomadic traders who carved Petra into rose-red cliffs, became masters of markups. They bought incense cheap at the source and sold it for 10 times the price in Mediterranean ports. Palmyra, another desert jewel, rose to power by controlling the northern branches of the route, its columns and temples funded by the endless flow of aromatic gold. But this wasn't just about profit, it was about survival. In a world where clean water was scarce and plagues rampant, myrrh's antiseptic properties made it as vital as medicine. A single shipment could save a city, yet like all good things, the incense route couldn't last forever. When Rome discovered direct sea routes to India, bypassing Arabian middlemen, the desert kingdoms began to wither. The final blow came with the rise of Christianity, which favored simpler rituals over pagan incense clouds. Slowly, the caravans grew smaller, the ports quieter, until the sands reclaimed the roads that once buzzed with life. Today, the ruins of Petra and Palmyra stand as silent witnesses to a time when the scent of resin shaped the fate of civilization's, proof that even the mightiest empires could rise and fall on the back of a single, fragrant tear from a tree. The Roman appetite for black pepper was nothing short of obsession. Imagine a society where this humble spice, now casually shaken onto pizzas, was once so valuable that sacks of it could buy land, pay soldiers, or even serve as ransom for cities. When Roman galleys first rounded the Arabian Peninsula, braving the monsoon winds to reach India's Malabar coast, they weren't just trading, they were on a quest for what historians call black gold. At the heart of this frenzy lay a simple truth: Rome couldn't get enough of pepper's fiery kick. It wasn't just about flavor. In an era before refrigeration, pepper masked the taste of spoiled meat, and its antimicrobial properties made it a crude but effective preservative. Wealthy Romans sprinkled it on everything from wine to desserts, and Emperor Domitian even built a special spice warehouse in Rome's docks to stockpile it. But the real shocker, at its peak, Rome was hemorrhaging silver to India, over 50 million sesterces annually, enough to fund an entire legion for decades. Pliny the Elder grumbled that India was draining the empire's coffers for a luxury that makes nothing but our food burn. The journey to secure this spice was a marvel of ancient logistics. Roman ships modeled after sturdy Arab dhows would depart Egypt's port of Berenice in July, riding the summer monsoon straight to India's southwestern coast. There, they traded silver ingots, Mediterranean glass, and even exotic African animals for pepper sacks piled high in bustling ports like Muziris. But here's the twist: the real power brokers were Arab and East African middlemen. The Nabateans, masters of the Red Sea trade, controlled the flow of pepper northward, while Aksumite merchants in Ethiopia acted as gatekeepers to the African interior. For every shipload that reached Rome, a dozen hands had taken their cut along the way. This trade didn't just enrich foreign kingdoms, it reshaped Roman technology. To survive the Indian Ocean's fury, shipwrights reinforced hulls with iron nails, added triangular lateen sails for better wind handling, and even experimented with early forms of the astrolabe for navigation. The Pepper route became a testing ground for innovations that would later define European exploration. Yet, like all booms, it couldn't last. When Rome's economy crumbled in the 3rd century, the pepper flow slowed to a trickle. Byzantium kept the trade alive through clever diplomacy with Axum, but the Golden Age was over. Today, the ruins of Muziris lie buried under Kerala's silt, and Roman coins still surface in Indian soil, silent reminders of an era when the fate of empires hinged on something as small as a peppercorn. While camel caravans trudging across the Gobi Desert dominate our imagination of ancient trade, an even more astonishing network thrived just out of sight on the water. The Maritime Silk Road was the stealth engine of globalization, a liquid highway where Chinese junks with bat-winged sails glided past Sumatran pirates. Persian merchants haggled over Tang dynasty porcelain in bustling port cities, and religions hitched rides on the same ships carrying spices and silk. Unlike its overland cousin, this route didn't just connect east and west, it wove together entire civilizations through the rhythm of the tides. At its peak, this sea route was a spectacle of human ambition. Picture a Chinese junk, its hull stacked with celadon vases so delicate they chimed like bells in the wind, sailing past the volcanic islands of Indonesia. These weren't just trade missions, they were floating cities carrying diplomats, astronomers, and even botanists tasked with collecting exotic plants. The Han dynasty didn't just stumble upon this route, they engineered it, sending envoys like Admiral Cheng centuries later with fleets so massive they blotted out the horizon. Their genius, recognizing that while deserts had bandits and mountains had avalanches, the sea offered something priceless: predictability. Monsoon winds blew like clockwork, carrying ships from Guangzhou to the Strait of Malacca in weeks, not months. But the real magic happened in the ports. In places like Quanju, a single dock could host Tamil Hindu traders bargaining in Sanskrit, Arab merchants unloading cobalt for China's famed blue and white porcelain, and Javanese sailors exchanging nutmeg for Persian carpets. This wasn't just commerce, it was a cultural laboratory. A Buddhist monk from India might disembark with a palm leaf manuscript, only to find his teachings merging with Taoist philosophy in a Chinese monastery. Paper-making technology, smuggled out of China by a captured scholar, would eventually jump from ship to ship until it reached Baghdad's House of Wisdom, revolutionizing knowledge itself. The Maritime Silk Road also had a dark side. Its wealth attracted predators. The Srivijaya Empire, based in Sumatra, grew fat on protection fees extorted from passing ships, while the Chola dynasty of India launched naval raids as far as Cambodia to control the flow of spices. And let's not forget the pirates, swift Malay proas lurking in the karst islands of Vietnam, or the notorious Waku raiders who terrorized Korea with stolen Chinese gunpowder weapons. Control the sea lanes, and you didn't just tax goods, you dictated which ideas lived or died. What's haunting is how much of this legacy slipped through history's fingers. When the Ming dynasty abruptly abandoned naval exploration in the 15th century, entire ports turned to ghost towns. The very ships that once carried Marco Polo rotted in silent harbors. Yet traces remain: a Persian astrolabe in a Guangzhou museum, a Sri Lankan coin stamped with Chinese characters, or the fact that the word ketchup comes from the Hokkien Chinese ker tsayap, a fish sauce traded along these routes. The Maritime Silk Road didn't just move cargo, It quietly stitched together the modern world, one wave at a time. Hidden in the turquoise waters between Sulawesi and New Guinea lay the original treasure islands, not gold or jewels, but something far more intoxicating. The Moluccas, a tiny volcanic archipelago no larger than a handful of scattered emeralds, held a monopoly on nature's rarest flavors. Here, nutmeg trees wept aromatic red mace over their seeds, and clove buds perfumed the air with a sweetness so potent, sailors could smell land before seeing it. These weren't just spices, they were biological miracles growing nowhere else on Earth, and their discovery would ignite a frenzy that toppled kingdoms. Arab traders were the first to crack the secret. As early as the 8th century, Amani Dhows slipped through pirate-infested straits, carrying cloves to Cairo's markets where they sold for 40 times their weight in silver. The trick: misdirection. Merchants spun wild tales of serpent-guarded forests and islands that sank beneath the waves to throw rivals off the scent. One Persian captain's logbook deliberately placed the Moluccas 300 miles west of their true location, an early example of corporate espionage. By the time Venetian explorer Niccolo da Conti pieced together the truth in the 1400s, the Arab monopoly was already crumbling under Portugal's cannons. Enter the Europeans armed with greed and gunpowder. When Magellan's surviving ship, the Victoria, limped back to Spain in 1522 with just 26 tons of cloves, enough to pay for the entire expedition, it sparked a colonial free-for-all. The Dutch went furthest, committing atrocities that would make even the conquistadors blanch. To maintain scarcity, VOC officers enforced a spice quarantine, executing anyone caught smuggling nutmeg saplings and torching entire harvests to keep prices sky-high. On the Banda Islands, they reduced the local population from 15,000 to 600 in a single decade, replacing them with enslaved laborers. The British, not to be outdone, traded Manhattan to the Dutch in 1667 for a tiny nutmeg-rich island called Run, making New York history's most expensive bargaining chip. But the real surprise: how these tiny spices reshaped science. Cloves became medieval Europe's first breath mint, believed to ward off plague. Nutmeg oil smoothed the stomachs of Tudor nobility after feasts, while mace found its way into everything from embalming fluid to love potions. Apothecaries ground them into theriac, a supposed cure all so revered that cities kept public stocks like modern vaccines. Even today, the ghost of that craze lingers. Your pumpkin pie spice mix owes its DNA to the Moluccan gold rush. What's chilling is how thoroughly the spice trade erased its own origins. The Bandanese who first cultivated nutmeg were nearly wiped out, their oral maps of monsoon winds and coral reefs lost forever. The clove forests of Ternate, once so dense they turned the horizon purple, now cling to survival in patchwork plantations. Yet every time we grate nutmeg over eggnog or press a clove into holiday ham, we're tasting the last echoes of an empire built not on land or gold, but on the fleeting scent of blossoms in a distant jungle. The Moluccas remind us that hunger for flavor, for profit, for power can redraw the world faster than any conqueror's sword. Far to the north, where the Baltic Sea churns under slate-gray skies, an unexpected treasure washed ashore, amber, nature's time capsule. This golden resin, hardened over millions of years, became the lifeblood of a trade network stretching from Scandinavian pine forests to the sun-baked courtyards of Mediterranean palaces. Unlike spices or silks, amber wasn't just traded, it carried secrets. Trapped within its honeyed depths, ancient insects and plant fragments preserved snapshots of prehistoric worlds, making it as much a scientific curiosity as a status symbol. The route began in what's now Lithuania and Poland, where storms would rip chunks of amber from submerged forests and toss them onto beaches, local tribes like the Prussians and Estonians gathered these tears of the gods, not yet realizing their worth. But Viking traders did. By the time their longships reached the Baltic's southern shores, amber had transformed from driftwood to currency. The Vikings weren't just raiders, they were masterful middlemen, hauling sacks of raw amber down rivers like the Vistula and Dnieper, where Byzantine merchants waited with scales and silk. Amber's allure lay in its paradox, a substance soft enough to carve yet durable enough to survive centuries. Egyptian pharaohs tucked amber beads into burial chambers, believing they held the sun's essence. Roman matrons wore amber pendants to ward off illness, while wealthy Greeks prized it for electrostatic properties, rubbing amber rods to attract feathers, an early glimpse of what we now call static electricity. Pliny the Elder marveled at how Baltic amber reached Rome despite so many savage nations between, a testament to trade's power to bridge even the most hostile territories. What's fascinating is how this trade shaped geopolitics. The Teutonic Knights, ostensibly crusaders, built castles along amber-rich coasts to control extraction. In Constantinople, Byzantine emperors used Baltic amber as diplomatic gifts, sending it as far as China's Tang dynasty. And here's the twist, the amber route indirectly funded Viking expansion. Silver coins minted in Baghdad, found in Scandinavian hoards, trace back to amber sales, proof that global connections thrived even in Europe's so-called Dark Ages. Today, walking the windswept beaches of the Baltic, you might still spot amber glinting in the surf. Each piece is a relic of an invisible highway that connected fishermen to emperors, turning something as simple as tree resin into a currency of empires. The amber route reminds us that beauty, not just necessity, has always driven human connection, and that even the coldest corners of the earth held heat enough to spark commerce. While the Sahara's dunes often steal the spotlight in tales of Africa's golden age, the real action was happening where the land met the sea. Picture the Swahili coast at dawn, a symphony of creaking wooden dhows, haggling merchants speaking a dozen languages, and the glint of freshly mined gold being weighed against blocks of Saharan salt. This wasn't just trade, it was alchemy, transforming the resources of one continent into the lifeblood of another. From Mogadishu's bustling wharves to Kilwa's coral stone palaces, these ports became the hinges on which the Indian Ocean's economy swung, proving Africa wasn't a passive player in history but a powerhouse rewriting the rules of commerce. The secret to this maritime gold rush lay in geography's cruel joke. West Africa's goldfields around modern Ghana and Mali sat hundreds of miles from the salt mines of the Sahara, a commodity so vital it fueled empires. Without refrigeration, salt preserved food, healed wounds, and sustained life itself. But here's what most histories miss. While camel caravans trudged across the desert, ships were racing along the coast to beat them to market. Arab and Persian traders, masters of the monsoon winds, realized it was faster to sail gold down Africa's eastern rivers to coastal ports than wait for overland caravans. The result, Kilwa's sultans grew so wealthy they paved their streets with limestone and lit their palaces with Persian glass lamps, while Mogadishu's merchants wore silks from Canton and dined on porcelain from Damascus. But gold wasn't the only currency changing hands. Ivory, carved into intricate chess sets for Indian royalty, flowed eastward alongside tortoiseshell and ambergris, a whale secretion so prized in perfumery it was dubbed floating gold. In return, African elites stocked their courts with glazed ceramics from Persia, steel blades from Yemen, and the ultimate status symbol, Chinese celadon pottery, whose jade-like hue was believed to detect poison. The Swahili cities became cultural melting pots where Bantu traditions blended with Arabic architecture and Hindu astrology, all financed by this liquid highway of goods. Yet this trade had a darker undercurrent. Enslaved Africans captured in inland raids were marched to the coast and loaded onto ships bound for Arabia, India, and beyond. Unlike the later transatlantic slave trade, this system was smaller in scale but lasted centuries, with Zanzibar emerging as its grim epicenter. The tragic irony. Many enslaved people were forced to mine the very gold that enriched their captors, a cycle of exploitation hidden behind the glitter of maritime commerce. What's breathtaking is how these connections reshaped the world. Kilwa's gold coins, stamped with Arabic script, have been found as far away as Australia's northern shores, likely carried by Indonesian fishermen. A single 14th century shipwreck off Tanzania yielded over 2,000 Chinese coins, proof of trade links stretching halfway across the globe. And when the Moroccan traveler Ibn Battuta visited Kilwa in 1331, he marveled at a city so prosperous its rulers showered guests with gifts of gold-dusted cloth. This wasn't some isolated backwater, it was the Wall Street of the medieval Indian Ocean. The real tragedy, European colonization, didn't just disrupt this network, it erased its memory. Portuguese cannons shattered Kilwa's palaces in 1505, and by the 19th century, the Swahili coast had been reduced to a footnote in Western textbooks. But walk the beaches of Zanzibar today, and you might still find fragments of Ming Dynasty porcelain tumbled smooth by the tide's whispers of an era when Africa's ports were the beating heart of a world connected not by empires, but by the endless rhythm of the sea. Beneath the dragon-prowed longships that struck terror into coastal villages lay a quieter, more enduring Viking legacy, one of calculated commerce. While their raids grabbed headlines, it was their mastery of trade routes that truly bankrolled the Viking Age. Picture a Norse trader poling his shallow, drafted gnar up the frozen Volga, its hull packed with Arctic fox pelts so luxuriously thick they shimmered like liquid silver in the firelight. These weren't just goods, they were passports to empires. The Vikings understood something revolutionary. In a world divided by faith and feud, luxury could bridge any gap. Their secret weapon, geography. Scandinavia's rivers functioned as natural highways, allowing Viking ships to pivot seamlessly from saltwater to freshwater trade. A single voyage might begin in Norway's fjords, where walrus ivory and reindeer hides were loaded, then weave through the Baltic to Novgorod's fur markets, before finally riding the Dnieper River south to Constantinople. The Rus, as these river-faring Vikings came to be known, didn't just transport goods, they became cultural translators. In Baghdad's bustling souks, they bartered amber for Arabic silver dirhams, coins that now litter Scandinavian archaeological sites by the thousands. Meanwhile, in Hedeby, Europe's northernmost trading hub, Frankish swords crossed paths with Sami shamans' drum skins, creating a bazaar where pagan and Christian, nomad and urbanite, all spoke the universal language of profit. But this trade had a grim underside. The same ships carrying furs south often returned with human cargo Slavic captives destined for Abbasid caliphates, where fair-skinned slaves fetched premium prices. Dublin became such a notorious slave market that an Irish chronicler lamented its streets were thick with the ankles of captives. Yet even this darkness spurred innovation. Viking traders developed early forms of trade credit, using notched wooden tallies called runsticks to record debts across language barriers. Their legal codes, surprisingly progressive for the era, included maritime insurance policies for lost cargo. What's often overlooked is how Viking trade reshaped ecosystems. The insatiable demand for Arctic furs pushed hunters deeper into Lapland, while Norse settlements in Greenland pivoted from farming to walrus ivory exports when the climate cooled. Their routes even altered fashion continents away. Byzantine aristocrats flaunted ermine-trimmed robes, while Arab scholars wrote of mysterious Rusia merchants arriving with honey that never spoiled, thanks to Scandinavia's unique fermentation techniques. The real testament to their network's reach, a 9th century Viking Age ring found in Sweden, inscribed with the Arabic phrase for Allah in Kufic script. Not looted, but traded, a silent witness to an era when Norse traders navigated not just rivers, but the shifting currents of faith and power. Their legacy wasn't just in the treasures they moved, but in the connections they forged between worlds that barely knew each other existed. The Viking trade routes remind us that globalization isn't a modern invention, it's a saga written in fur, silver, and the wake of 1,000 ships. The scale of Admiral Cheng, his treasure fleets, still defies belief. Imagine 300 ships gliding across the Indian Ocean, their sails like a moving city blotting out the horizon. At the heart of this armada were the legendary treasure ships, 9-masted colossuses stretching over 400 feet long, dwarfing even Columbus's Santa Maria by a factor of 5. But these weren't warships bristling with cannons. They were floating embassies, their holds packed with Ming porcelain so exquisite it made sultans weep, bolts of silk embroidered with dragons, and stacks of silver ingots stamped with the emperor's seal. Cheng, he wasn't just exploring, he was conducting the most ambitious soft power campaign in history, using gifts, not gunpowder, to rewrite the rules of engagement. What's often overlooked is the sheer logistical genius behind these voyages. While European explorers later stumbled through unknown waters, Cheng, his fleet moved with precision. Thanks to star charts so accurate they included corrections for magnetic declination, a technology Europe wouldn't master for another century. His navigators used fire clocks to measure time at sea and deployed a sophisticated flag signaling system to coordinate hundreds of vessels, the real stroke of brilliance. Recognizing that trade flowed both ways, when the fleet docked in Malacca, they didn't just unload Chinese goods, they collected frankincense from Oman, zebras from Somalia, and even a giraffe from Kenya that the Ming court mistook for a mythical killin, a celestial omen. Yet the most enduring legacy wasn't in the cargo holds, it was in the alliances. In Calicut, Cheng, he mediated disputes between rival Hindu and Muslim factions, leaving behind a stone tablet inscribed in 3 languages as a pledge of peace. In Sri Lanka, he funded Buddhist temples alongside mosques, a gesture of respect that local chronicles still recount. These weren't the actions of a conqueror, but of a diplomat who understood that true influence came from cultural fluency. The fleet's interpreters included speakers of Arabic, Tamil, and Swahili, turning each port call into a cross-cultural symposium. The tragedy lies in what could have been. When the Yongle Emperor died in 1424, China's new rulers saw the voyages as extravagant folly. Scholars burned navigation records, shipyards were shuttered, and by the time Portuguese caravels rounded Africa, China's maritime maps were gathering dust in forgotten archives. The irony, Cheng's voyages had already planted the seeds of globalization. A Sri Lankan mosque built with Chinese tiles, East African families with surnames tracing back to Ming sailors, and fragments of blue and white porcelain scattered from Zanzibar to Java. Had those fleets kept sailing, the Indian Ocean might have become a Chinese lake centuries before European expansion. Instead, the treasure routes vanished like footprints in tidewash, leaving behind only whispers of an alternate world where empires rose not through conquest, but through the quiet power of porcelain and mutual respect. The real treasure wasn't what Cheng he brought home. It was the vision he left behind, one where the sea connected civilizations rather than dividing them. Rome's hunger was a force of nature, and Egypt's wheat fields were the only thing standing between the empire and chaos. Picture the docks of Ostia at dawn, where towering grain ships from Alexandria unloaded their golden cargo under armed guard, each sack destined for the insatiable stomach of a city that swelled to over 1 million mouths. This wasn't just commerce, it was a lifeline. Without the 400,000 tons of grain shipped annually from Egypt's fertile Nile Delta, Rome's plebeians would have starved, its legions mutinied, and its emperors toppled. The Mediterranean grain trade wasn't merely a route. It was the pulse of an empire ticking to the rhythm of the harvest and the whims of the wind. What made this trade so revolutionary was its sheer bureaucracy. The Roman state didn't leave grain shipments to chance. They were a militarized operation. Specially designed ships called corbetti, with hulls wider than a city street, could carry up to 1,000 tons of grain, enough to feed 30,000 people for a month. These vessels moved in convoys protected by the Roman navy, because losing a single shipment could spark riots like the one in 51 BCE, when Pompey had to hijack private merchant ships to avert famine. Emperors like Augustus didn't just oversee the grain dole, they micromanaged it, appointing a praefectus annoni whose sole job was ensuring no Roman went hungry. The message was clear: bread was power and the sea was its delivery system, but the grain trade's tentacles stretched far beyond Rome. When Egypt sneezed, the Mediterranean caught a cold. A bad Nile flood meant skyrocketing wheat prices in Antioch. A pirate raid off Crete could empty bakeries in Athens. This interdependence created a geopolitical chessboard where control of ports like Carthage or Leptis Magna meant leverage over rivals. Cleopatra famously used grain as a weapon, threatening to withhold shipments from Rome during her standoffs with Octavian. Even the Jewish revolt in 66 CE had an undercurrent of grain politics. Roman troops prioritized securing Galilee's wheat stores over chasing rebels. The real surprise: how this trade birthed innovations we still use today. Roman grain ships featured watertight compartments and bilge pumps, early ancestors of modern shipping safety measures. They pioneered futures contracts where merchants paid Egyptian farmers upfront for next year's harvest, and the Annona system, the state-run grain distribution, was arguably history's first social welfare program, with plebeians receiving monthly rations stamped with imperial seals. Yet the grain trade's greatest legacy was its fragility. When volcanic ash from Mount Vesuvius's eruption in 79 CE clogged the skies, cooling the Mediterranean and disrupting harvests, Rome teetered. Later, when Vandal pirates severed the African grain routes in the 5th century, the Western Empire crumbled within decades. The lesson was brutal. No matter how mighty your legions or grand your monuments, a civilization is only as stable as its next shipment of bread. Today, as container ships crisscross the globe carrying wheat from Ukraine or soy from Brazil, we're still playing by Rome's oldest rule: whoever controls the routes controls the fate of nations. Beneath the turquoise shallows of the Red Sea, a treasure grew not in chests, but on the ocean floor coral, its fiery branches pulsing with life. To ancient Indians, these weren't just reefs. They were divine talismans, carved into amulets to ward off evil and ground into potions said to cure everything from fever to heartbreak. The demand was so fierce that Arab and Indian traders braved the Red Sea's razor-sharp reefs and pirate-infested straits, their dhows laden with coral chunks wrapped in damp kelp to keep them from cracking in the sun. This wasn't merely a trade in trinkets. It was a high-stakes race to harvest what many believed were the petrified tears of ocean gods. The journey from reef to marketplace was a masterclass in ancient logistics. Divers, often enslaved or debt-bound, plunged without oxygen to depths that left their ears bleeding, hacking coral with iron chisels while sharks circled above. The finest red coral, with its deep, blood-like hue was reserved for temples and royalty, while paler fragments trickled down to merchants and healers. But here's the twist. The real profits came from value-added craftsmanship. Arab middlemen in ports like Aden bought raw coral cheap, then shipped it to Indian workshops in Gujarat and Kerala, where artisans transformed it into intricate figurines of deities, wedding necklaces, and even architectural inlays for palaces. A single carved coral pendant could fetch 10 times its weight in silver once it reached inland courts. This trade route did more than move goods, it stitched together worlds. Ethiopian Christian crosses began incorporating coral beads after traders introduced them as protective charms. Hindu temple sculptures in Ellora showed deities wearing coral ornaments likely sourced from Eritrean reefs. Even perfumes got in on the act. Arabian myrrh was often blended with powdered coral in India, creating scented pastes believed to enhance spiritual purity. The cultural exchange flowed both ways. Indian shipbuilders taught Red Sea traders how to reinforce hulls with coconut fiber, while Arab navigators shared monsoon wind charts that cut sailing times to India by weeks. Yet the coral routes also had a dark legacy, overharvesting devastated reefs that had taken millennia to grow, with some beds near Jeddah stripped bare by the medieval era. The trade's human cost was equally grim. Divers rarely lived past 30, their lungs scarred by repeated deep-sea pressure. And when Portuguese cannons disrupted the Red Sea networks in the 16th century, entire coastal communities that had depended on coral craftsmanship collapsed into poverty. Today, walking through Kochi's Jewtown or Muscat Souks, you might still spot antique coral pieces faded now, but once vibrant enough to inspire wars and worships alike. These fragments are more than souvenirs. They're fossils of globalization, proof that even something as fragile as coral could sculpt the fate of nations. The real magic wasn't in the reefs themselves, but in the invisible currents of desire that turned them into bridges between continents. Buried deep in the mountains of Afghanistan's Badakhshan province lay a treasure more coveted than gold, Lapis Lazuli, a stone so vividly blue it seemed to hold fragments of the midnight sky. Long before synthetic dyes, this gem's celestial hue became the ultimate status symbol, adorning everything from Tutankhamun's funeral mask to the eyebrows of Sumerian goddesses. But here's the twist. While camel caravans carried lapis across deserts, the stone's journey didn't end there. Maritime traders in the Persian Gulf transformed this landlocked mineral into a global commodity, proving that even the most remote treasures could ride the waves to immortality. The logistics were staggering. Miners in Sa-e-Sang, working at altitudes that left them gasping, chiseled lapis from cliffs using techniques unchanged for millennia. From there, the rough stones traveled by donkey to the Oxus River, where barges floated them south to the bustling ports of the Indus Valley civilization. But the real alchemy happened on the docks of Dilmun, modern Bahrain, where Mesopotamian merchants swapped silver and cedar wood for sacks of raw lapis, then loaded them onto ships bound for and beyond. These weren't simple cargo runs, they were high-stakes ventures. A single shipment could buy a palace, and pirates knew it. Clay tablets from Mari warn of sea bandits preying on lapis-laden vessels near the Strait of Hormuz. What's mesmerizing is how lapis transcended mere decoration. In Egypt, priests ground it into powder for ultramarine eyeshadow, believing it warded off evil. Cleopatra's iconic coal may have contained flecks of Afghan stone. Babylonians inlaid it into the Ishtar Gate's glazed bricks, creating a blue so intense it stunned visitors. Even death couldn't diminish its allure. Neolithic burials in the Caucasus placed lapis beads in graves as passports to the afterlife. The stone's rarity bred legends. One Assyrian tablet claims the gods themselves mined lapis, where the earth meets the sky, Yet the most enduring legacy lies in the trade's ripple effects. Lapis routes became cultural arteries. Harappan seals found in Mesopotamia bear traces of Afghan stone, proving these exchanges predated written history. When Cretan artisans fashioned Minoan frescoes with lapis pigment, they were tapping into a supply chain stretching 4,000 miles. Even today, Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel owes its brilliance to the same Afghan quarries. His ultramarine blue was lapis ground to dust, a pigment so expensive patrons specified its use in contracts. The real tragedy: modern politics have silenced these ancient networks. The same Badakhshan mines that supplied pharaohs now lie trapped behind conflict and closed borders. But in museums worldwide, from Cairo to Paris, lapis artifacts still glow with the secret history of a stone that connected deserts to oceans, mortals to gods, and proved that beauty could move mountains, or at least sail around them. In the dense jungles of Burma, a silent giant held the key to maritime empires, the teak tree. Unlike ordinary timber, Burmese teak possessed an almost magical resistance to rot and shipworms, bending but never breaking under monsoon storms. Shipwrights from Arabia to India prized it above all else, knowing a hull built from these golden brown planks could outlast its crew by decades. This wasn't just a trade in wood. It was the skeleton key to global commerce, supplying the very vessels that carried silks, spices, and empires across the waves. The journey from forest to flagship was a marvel of ancient engineering. Elephants, their hides glistening with sweat, dragged felled teak trunks to riverbanks, where monsoon floods carried them downstream to coastal yards. In ports like Martaban and Bago, Tamil craftsmen teamed up with Arab merchants to transform raw logs into floating fortresses. The technique: seasoning the wood in tidal flats, allowing briny water to seep into its fibers, locking out decay like nature's own preservative. A single Burmese teak ship could weather 50 years of Indian Ocean trade, 3 times the lifespan of European oak vessels. No wonder the Sultan of Malacca demanded his warships be built exclusively from this wood that never dies. But the real genius of the teak trade lay in its self-perpetuating cycle. Ships made of teak carried teak to new shipyards, which built more ships to fetch more teak. Arab dhows constructed in Gujarat from Burmese timber sailed back to Burma for repairs, creating a feedback loop of craftsmanship and commerce. The Portuguese, upon capturing Goa in 1510, didn't just seize a port, they commandeered its teak stockpiles, knowing control of this resource meant control of the seas. Even the British East India Company later fought 3 Anglo-Burmese wars partly to secure these priceless forests. Teak's legacy extended far beyond practicality. In Java, temples used salvaged ship timbers as pillars, their grain still smelling of salt centuries later. The iconic Bagla and Boom ships of Oman, with their crescent-shaped sterns, owed their elegance to teak's workability. And when a typhoon scattered a Ming fleet off Vietnam, the sole surviving vessel was a Burmese teak junk, its ribs intact while iron-nailed ships shattered around it. What's haunting is how this trade reshaped landscapes. Vast tracts of Burma's forests vanished into hulls, leaving behind ghostly stumps. Yet without this silent sacrifice, the Indian Ocean's golden age of trade might have sunk before it ever sailed. The next time you marvel at an ancient map filled with ships, remember, behind every painted sail lay the bones of a Burmese giant, the unsung hero that carried the world on its back. Beneath the calm turquoise waters of the Persian Gulf, a hidden treasure lured men to their death's pearls, nature's perfect accidents. These luminous orbs formed when a grain of sand irritated an oyster into coating it with layers of nacre, became the ultimate status symbol across 3 continents. Roman matrons sewed them into their hairnets to shimmer at banquets. Indian maharajas embedded them in throne canopies, and Tang dynasty emperors accepted them as tribute from foreign envoys. But the real story wasn't in the palaces, it was in the suffocating depths where divers, often enslaved or indebted, plunged on a single breath to pry oysters from the seabed, their ears bleeding from the pressure and their lungs burning for air. The pearl fisheries operated with brutal efficiency. From April to September, fleets of wooden dhows anchored above the Gulf's richest beds, their crews working dawn to dusk. Divers tied stone weights to their feet to sink faster, clutching nose clips made of tortoiseshell. A skilled man could make 60 dives a day, each lasting over 2 minutes, scouring the murky bottom for oysters that might or might not contain a gem. The mortality rate was staggering. Portuguese explorer Duarte Barbosa wrote in 1516 of divers surfacing with blood-flecked foam on their lips, their bodies broken by decompression sickness. Yet the rewards justified the risk. A single perfect pearl could buy a diver's freedom, while a season's haul might fill a merchant's coffers with enough silver to build a mansion. Bahrain emerged as the trade's beating heart, its market so saturated with pearls that medieval travelers claimed you could smell the oyster piles from miles away. Arab merchants perfected the art of grading, sorting pearls into 72 distinct categories based on size, luster, and symmetry. The finest, called Basra tiers, fetched prices comparable to diamonds in Venice or Zion. But the real profits flowed through an intricate web of middlemen. Jewish traders in Hormuz smuggled pearls into Persia, while Gujarati bankers in Surat advanced loans against future harvests, creating an early form of commodity futures. Pearls didn't just enrich merchants, they built cities. Oman's rise as a naval power was bankrolled by pearl taxes, while Bahrain's Khalat al-Bahrain fortress stood guard over the trade routes. Even distant powers got involved. The Sassanid Empire demanded pearls as war reparations, and China's Ming dynasty listed them among treasures from the Western Oceans worthy of imperial collection. The trade's cultural impact was equally profound. Persian poets compared pearls to dewdrops or stars, Hindu texts prescribed them as medicinal powders, and Byzantine icons used crushed pearl pigment to paint the Virgin Mary's robes. Yet this glittering trade had a dark nucleus. Divers were often locked into generational debt, their earnings perpetually outpaced by advances for food and gear. When Japanese cultured pearls flooded the market in the 1920s, the Gulf's fisheries collapsed overnight, leaving entire communities destitute. Today, Bahrain's National Museum displays pearl diving equipment beside heartbreaking ledgers recording debts never repaid, a silent testament to the human cost of beauty. The next time you see an antique pearl necklace, remember, its luster carries the ghosts of those who gave their breath to bring it to light. The glow of Cyprus's copper mines lit the way to an age that still bears its name, the Bronze Age. Hidden beneath this Mediterranean island's rugged terrain lay veins of malachite and azurite, ores so rich that a single furnace load could yield pure copper ingots shaped like ox hides, ready to be stacked in ship holds. These weren't just lumps of metal, they were the building blocks of empires. When Egyptian pharaohs commissioned statues of their gods or Mycenaean kings armed their warriors, odds are the copper came from Cyprus, carried across the waves in ships that turned this unassuming island into the ancient equivalent of an industrial superpower. What made Cypriot copper so revolutionary was its purity. Unlike the mixed ores found elsewhere, Cyprus's deposits required minimal smelting, producing copper so soft it could be worked like clay yet strong enough to hold an edge when alloyed with tin. The island's name itself became synonymous with the metal cupros. In Greek gave us the word copper, but the real genius lay in distribution. Cypriot merchants didn't just sell raw ingots, they pioneered value-added trade. Archaeologists have found pre-formed axe heads and spear tips from Cyprus as far away as the Nile Delta and Troy, proof that the island wasn't just a mine, it was a workshop fueling the arms race of antiquity. The trade routes radiating from Cyprus read like a map of Bronze Age geopolitics. Ships laden with copper sailed east to Byblos, where Phoenicians traded cedar wood for ingots to cast temple doors. Others headed south to Egypt, where copper chisels carved hieroglyphs into eternity. But the most lucrative route ran west to Crete and mainland Greece, where Mycenaean warlords craved Cypriot metal to forge the swords that would dominate the Aegean. The wreck of Uluburun, a Bronze Age ship found off Turkey's coast, held 10 tons of Cypriot copper, enough to outfit an army alongside ebony, ivory, and cobalt glass, a snapshot of how copper anchored entire economies. Cyprus's copper didn't just move goods, it moved ideas. Hittite smiths working in Cypriot mines brought advanced furnace techniques that boosted production. Egyptian jewelers taught locals how to inlay copper with gold, creating artworks that became status symbols from Babylon to Thebes. Even the island's script, Cypro-Minon, evolved to track shipments, making Cyprus the birthplace of maritime logistics. The island became a cultural blender where Anatolian, Levantine, and Aegean traditions fused in the heat of the forge, yet this trade had a dark undercurrent. The demand for copper fueled conflicts like the Trojan War, where control of metal routes may have been the real prize behind Helen's legend. Cypriot mines relied on slave labor, with prisoners of war sent underground in shifts that lasted until collapse or suffocation. And when the Bronze Age collapsed around 1200 BCE, Cyprus's copper wealth made it a target invaded by sea peoples who burned the ports that had once fed civilizations. Today, the slag heaps of ancient smelters still stain Cyprus's hillsides rust red, and museums display oxhide ingots stamped with the marks of long-dead merchants. These relics remind us that the modern world's obsession with oil and silicon has an ancient parallel, a time when empires rose and fell on the back of a metal so essential, it shaped the very name of an era. The next time you flip a penny, remember, 2,000 years before coins, copper from this island was already buying kingdoms. The Aegean's vineyards didn't just produce wine, they bottled civilization itself. Imagine a clay amphora bobbing in the hold of a Roman merchant ship, its belly sloshing with dark, resin-infused wine from Crete, destined for a Celtic chieftain's feast in distant Gaul. This wasn't mere cargo, it was liquid prestige, a taste of Mediterranean sophistication that could elevate a tribal leader's status or sanctify a temple ritual. The sheer volume of this trade still stuns archaeologists. Over 1,500 ancient shipwrecks found in the Mediterranean alone carry stacks of amphorae, some vessels holding as many as 10,000 jars. Each one was a time capsule, stamped with the maker's mark and the vintage year, proving wine was big business long before modern appellation laws. What made Greek and Roman wines so irresistible wasn't just flavor, it was marketing. Greeks diluted their wine with seawater for a briny tang, while Romans added honey and spices to mask rough vintages, but the real secret lay in the packaging. Those iconic amphorae with their pointed bases and narrow necks weren't just decorative, they were engineering marvels, stacked like chess pieces in ship hulls. Their shape prevented breakage during storms, while the porous clay allowed slight oxidation, mellowing the wine during long voyages. The Romans even developed a precursor to modern branding amphorae from certain estates, like Pompeii's famed Vesuvinum, commanded premium prices as far away as Britain and India. The wine trade's cultural impact fermented far beyond the banquet table. Greek colonists planting vines in Sicily and southern France didn't just export grapes, they transplanted entire lifestyles. Local elites from Hispania to the Black Sea emulated Greek symposia, where politics and philosophy flowed as freely as wine. Roman legions marching through Gaul carried vine cuttings like weapons, turning conquered lands into vineyards that still produce today. Bordeaux's legendary terroir, it owes its roots to Roman veterans retiring there with vine stock pensions. Even wine's spiritual role spread along these routes. Dionysian cults in Greece became Bacchic mysteries in Rome, their rituals smuggled aboard wine ships like theological contraband. Yet this trade also had its hangovers. Counterfeit wine plagued ancient markets. Pliny the Elder complained about Roman merchants dyeing cheap vintages with elderberry juice to mimic premium Fascination. Pirates stalked wine-laden ships near Malta, where a single captured vessel could fund a year of raiding. And when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 CE, it didn't just bury Pompeii, it obliterated the Mediterranean's Napa Valley, sending wine prices soaring across the empire. The real legacy of these ancient wine routes lies in their invisible fingerprints. Next time you sip a Spanish Rioja or French Burgundy, you're tasting the descendant of vines that climbed aboard Greek triremes 2,000 years ago. The amphorae may be gone, replaced by glass bottles and barcodes, but the DNA of that first globalized commodity still lingers in every cork pulled and toast made. From the chalky soils of Champagne to the sun-baked hills of Tuscany, the world's great wine regions all share one thing in common. They grew from the roots of an ancient trade that proved civilization could be bottled, shipped, and savored. Long before bronze or iron reshaped human civilization, there was obsidian, nature's razor-sharp gift, forged in volcanic fire. Picture a Neolithic craftsman on the shores of the Aegean, carefully chipping a chunk of glossy black glass into a blade so keen it could slice through animal hide like water. This wasn't just a tool, it was the iPhone of its day, a technological marvel traded across hundreds of miles by seafaring middlemen who understood its worth. The island of Melos, a speck in the Cyclades, became the Silicon Valley of the Stone Age, its volcanic slopes producing obsidian so prized that fragments from its quarries have been found in Egyptian burial sites and Anatolian villages, proving even prehistoric societies had their own version of global supply chain. What made obsidian irresistible was its perfection. Unlike flint, which could shatter unpredictably, obsidian fractured into edges just one molecule thick, sharper than modern surgical steel. Hunters from Crete to Cyprus coveted it for arrowheads that pierced hides cleanly, while early surgeons used it for precise incisions. But here's the twist: Melos had no monopoly on volcanoes. What set its obsidian apart was the island's position at the crossroads of emerging sea routes. Miners extracted the glass-like rock using deer antler picks. Then coastal traders loaded it onto reed boats or hollowed-out logs, navigating by the stars to reach mainland markets. The real innovation wasn't the material itself, but the distribution network that turned local stone into an international commodity. This trade didn't just move goods, it moved knowledge. A Melos obsidian blade found in a Balkan village wasn't just a tool, it was a blueprint teaching distant cultures advanced knapping techniques. The routes also carried less tangible cargo, ideas about navigation, early forms of contract bargaining, and even artistic styles. Archaeologists can trace the spread of spiral carvings from Melos to Malta, suggesting that obsidian traders were the original influencers, spreading trends along with their wares. Yet the obsidian trade's greatest legacy was its foreshadowing. These early voyages laid the mental maps later used by Minoan and Phoenician traders. The same currents that carried Stone Age boats would, millennia later, guide Greek triremes and Roman grain ships, and when Melos's quarries finally exhausted, the networks they'd created lived on, repurposed for copper, wine, and silk. The next time you use a glass screen or stainless steel scalpel, remember, you're holding the spiritual descendant of a trade that began with volcanic glass and the audacity of sailors who dared to think beyond the horizon. Far to the northwest, where the Atlantic crashes against Britain's rugged shores, the moors of Cornwall hid a treasure more valuable than gold, at least to the ancient world. Tin, that unassuming silvery metal, was the secret ingredient that turned copper into bronze, launching humanity out of the Stone Age and into an era of swords, shields, and towering monuments. While the Mediterranean glittered with polished marble and gold, it was this windswept corner of Britain that quietly fueled the engines of progress, its tin flowing along trade routes so vast they connected Celtic chieftains to pharaohs. The Phoenicians, those masterful maritime middlemen, were the first to recognize Cornwall's potential. Sailing past the pillars of Hercules' modern Gibraltar into the terrifying unknown of the Atlantic, they braved storms and superstition to reach what Greek historians later called the Cassiterides, the Tin Islands. These voyages weren't for the faint-hearted. Ancient sailors whispered of sea monsters and waters that boiled at the edge of the world, yet the Phoenicians pressed on, lured by prophets that could make a merchant king. Their ships, sleek and low in the water, returned to the Mediterranean laden with ingots of Cornish tin, each one stamped with cryptic symbols to denote purity. A single voyage could yield enough metal to arm an entire city-state, and the Phoenicians guarded their routes as fiercely as state secrets. What's astonishing is how this trade transformed Cornwall from a backwater into a hub of innovation. Local tribes, once isolated, suddenly found themselves at the center of a continental network. Mining techniques leaped forward as Celtic clans dug deeper pits, using animal fat and primitive pumps to keep groundwater at bay. Coastal settlements like Mounts Bay became bustling ports where traders bartered tin for exotic luxuries, amber from the Baltic, wine from Greece, and even glass beads from Egypt. The archaeological record tells the story. Hoards of Mediterranean coins found in Cornish soil, Celtic chieftains buried with imported bronze cauldrons, and tin ingots recovered from shipwrecks off the coast of Spain. But the real ripple effects were cultural. The demand for tin didn't just enrich Cornwall, it reshaped its identity. Hill forts grew larger as local elites consolidated power, controlling access to mines. Celtic artisans, inspired by foreign designs, began crafting intricate bronze work that blended Atlantic and Mediterranean styles. Even language evolved. Cornish miners likely picked up fragments of Phoenician trading jargon, while Mediterranean scribes struggled to transcribe the names of British chieftains. This was globalization in its earliest form, proving that even the most remote corners of the world couldn't resist the pull of commerce. The legacy of this trade still whispers through Cornwall today. The ruins of engine houses from later tin mining booms stand as monuments to a tradition stretching back millennia. Place names like Stannery, derived from the Latin stannum for tin, hint at the metal's enduring grip on the region's soul. And when archaeologists recently analyzed Bronze Age swords from Greece, they found trace elements matching Cornish ore, silent testimony to a network that once bound a windswept British coast to the sun-bathed palaces of Mycenae. The tin trade reminds us that resources shape destinies, and that even the mightiest civilizations once depended on the courage of sailors willing to venture beyond the edge of the known world. Beneath the vast Pacific skies, where waves carve invisible highways between islands, an economy older than empires thrived, one built not on gold or spices, but on the iridescent whispers of the sea. Long before European sails dotted the horizon, Polynesian navigators were trading treasures pulled from the reef, armbands carved from giant clam shell, necklaces strung with spiny oyster pearls, and tools edged with razor-sharp coral. These weren't mere trinkets, they were the lifeblood of a maritime network stretching thousands of miles, where a single conch shell could buy passage on an outrigger or seal a marriage alliance between distant atolls. The genius of this trade lay in its reciprocity. In the Solomon Islands, shell money called tafulier was painstakingly ground into discs, then threaded onto fiber cords in specific lengths denoting value, a currency recognized from New Guinea to Fiji. Meanwhile, in Tahiti, prized red feather headdresses often incorporated cowrie shells from Micronesian waters, proving that prestige could cross linguistic barriers. But the real surprise, how these exchanges doubled as environmental adaptation. When volcanic eruptions devastated Tonga's shellfish beds around 1400 CE, trade networks instantly rerouted, funneling replacements from Samoa and Fiji to prevent cultural collapse. The sea wasn't just a road, it was a safety net. Navigational feats made it possible. Using only the stars, swell patterns, and flights of seabirds, Pacific Islanders piloted their double-hulled canoes with precision that still baffles modern sailors. A single voyage might carry Fijian, tambua, whale's teeth to Vanuatu in exchange for obsidian, then hop to the Santa Cruz Islands for turmeric-stained shell belts. These routes weren't random, they followed strict protocols. In the Marshall Islands, stick charts made from palm ribs mapped currents and wave refraction points, an ancient GPS system passed down through chants. The Carolinian PWO ceremony inducted navigators into a sacred brotherhood, their knowledge so vital that losing one was considered a greater tragedy than losing a chief. What's often overlooked is how this trade shaped social structures. In Papua New Guinea's Massim region, the Kula Ring created a centuries-old ceremonial exchange cycle where shell armbands traveled clockwise between islands, while necklaces moved counterclockwise, binding communities in a web of obligation and trust that prevented warfare. Similarly, Hawaiian Le Niho Palaya necklaces, crafted from sperm whale teeth and braided human hair, weren't just adornments but living contracts, recording genealogies and land rights in their intricate patterns. The dark shadow of this brilliance came with European contact. Missionaries dismissed shell wealth as primitive, disrupting economies that had flourished for millennia. Colonial powers imposed metal currencies, rendering intricate systems of value obsolete, yet traces endure. In Palau, traditional, endowed stone money still backs major transactions, its worth calculated by ancestral memory rather than banks. And when archaeologists recently analyzed Cook Islands' coral tools, they found microscopic traces of obsidian from Samoa, proof that these routes never truly vanished, only sank beneath the surface of history. The Pacific's lesson is clear. Long before globalization became a buzzword, the ocean's first traders were mastering its rhythms, turning tides into treaties and shells into sovereignty. The Indian Ocean's sapphire waters carried more than spices and silk. They bore the weight of human lives in chains, a traffic so vast it reshaped continents yet remains half buried in history's shadows. Unlike the Atlantic slave trade's industrialized brutality, this was a system of unsettling intimacy where enslaved Africans, Circassians from the Caucasus, and Balinese from Southeast Asia became entangled in networks stretching from Zanzibar's clove plantations to the marble courtyards of Mughal palaces. The scale staggers. Between the 9th and 19th centuries, an estimated 12 million people were trafficked across these routes, a number rivaling the Atlantic trade, yet scarcely remembered today. What made this trade distinct was its fragmentation. There were no triangular routes or centralized markets, but rather a patchwork of regional systems. Arab dhows transported Bantu-speaking captives from Mozambique to date farms in Oman. Portuguese carracks packed with enslaved Bengalis docked at Malacca's spice warehouses. Persian galleys hauled Georgian and Armenian women to harems in Baghdad, their fair skin fetching premium prices. Slavery here wasn't solely racialized, it was opportunistic, with war captives, debtors, and kidnapped children all flowing through ports like Mombasa, Aden, and Aceh. The common thread, the sea's ruthless efficiency as a conveyor of human misery. The role slaves played expose uncomfortable truths about pre-modern societies. African men like the Zanj were forced to drain Iraq's salt marshes in revolts so devastating they nearly toppled the Abbasid Caliphate. Javanese women became currency in Dutch East India Company deals, traded alongside nutmeg and pepper. Ethiopian eunuchs guarded Ottoman sultans, their voices silenced but their political influence whispering through palace corridors. Even the iconic Swahili stone towns, those coral-studded wonders, were built by enslaved hands, their beauty masking the brutality of their foundations. Religion twisted through this trade like a double-edged sword. Muslim jurists penned meticulous rules about treating slaves humanely. Yet Zanzibar's sultans auctioned thousands in open markets beneath Quranic inscriptions. Hindu caste systems justified the enslavement of lower-born groups for maritime labor, while Christian Portuguese baptized enslaved children on ship decks before selling them in Goa. The sea, indifferent to theology, carried all alike. The lingering scars are visible today. Swahili DNA shows markers from Balochistan and Gujarat, evidence of centuries of forced migrations. The Makrani people of Pakistan descend from African slaves brought by Omani traders, their rhythmic drumming preserving echoes of lost homelands. On Madagascar's coasts, light-skinned descendants of concubines still face social stigma, living testaments to a trade that blurred bloodlines and borders. Perhaps most haunting is how these routes birthed diasporas with no homeland to return to. Atlantic slave descendants can often trace roots to specific West African ethnic groups, but Indian Ocean slaves were scattered like driftwood across 30 countries, their origins erased by countless transfers between dhow captains and caravan traders. When archaeologists recently unearthed manacles on Mauritius shores, too small for adult wrists, they confronted the trade's most vulnerable victims, children whose stories sank beneath the waves forever. This wasn't just a chapter of maritime history, it was a cautionary tale of how the same currents that carried progress could also deepen suffering, proving that the sea's greatest power lies not in separating civilizations, but in connecting them for better or worse. The shimmering salt pans of the Adriatic held a treasure far more valuable than gold in the medieval world: crystalline white salt, heaped in mounds like miniature Alps under the Mediterranean sun. While kings fought over land and merchants haggled over silks, it was this unassuming mineral that quietly greased the wheels of European commerce, from the fish markets of Scandinavia to the meat-smoking houses of Prague. Venice, that floating city of canals and intrigue, didn't rise to power on art or armies alone. Its dominance was built on salt, a commodity so essential that workers were often paid in pinches of it, giving us the word salary, and proving that empires could be forged from the very stuff of daily survival. Harvesting this white gold was a ballet of precision and patience. In the shallow lagoons of Chioggia and Servia, laborers known as sailonari channeled seawater into vast evaporation ponds, raking the crystallized crusts under the watchful eyes of Venetian overseers. The process mirrored the seasons. Spring floods filled the basins, summer sun concentrated the brine, and autumn winds dried the salt into glistening pyramids. But here's what made Adriatic salt exceptional: its purity. Unlike the gritty, mineral-heavy salts mined from mountains, Venetian salt dissolved evenly, making it ideal for preserving delicate foods like Mediterranean fish and Parma hams. A single shipload could preserve enough cod to feed a northern city through winter, turning Venice into the medieval equivalent of a frozen foods distributor. The Republic's genius lay in its ruthless control of the salt chain. By law, all merchant ships passing through the Adriatic had to stop in Venice and purchase set quantities of salt, whether they needed it or not. This forced demand created artificial scarcity, allowing Venetian traders to manipulate prices across Europe. They'd stockpile salt in warehouses like the massive Magazzini del Sale near the Rialto, releasing it in calculated dribbles to keep markets hungry. When rival cities like Ravenna tried to undercut them, Venetian diplomats leaned on the Pope to excommunicate competitors, a medieval version of corporate sabotage. Salt routes became the hidden scaffolding of medieval globalization. Venetian galleys, their hulls packed with salt sacks, followed ancient Celtic trails northward, swapping their cargo for Baltic amber and Flemish wool at the great trading fairs of Champagne. In Constantinople, Venetian salt bought access to Byzantine silks, which were then traded in Alexandria for spices, a triangular trade that made the Republic staggeringly rich. The Fondaco dei Tedeschi, Venice's German trading house, became a clearinghouse where salt flowed north and silver flowed south, financing the city's golden domes and Titian masterpieces. Yet the salt trade's real legacy was its democratization of flavor. Before refrigeration, salt was the great equalizer. It allowed a Norwegian fisherman and a Florentine butcher to enjoy preserved foods of similar quality. Venetian salt routes spread culinary techniques too. The Hungarian practice of dry salting meats likely traveled up the Adriatic trade networks, giving us prosciutto and its smoky cousins. Even the word salad traces back to salted greens dressed with what else? A Venetian brine. The decline came not from competition, but from geography. As new salt deposits were discovered in places like Poland and Spain, Venice's monopoly crumbled. But walk the abandoned saltworks of Pag Island today, and you'll still find crusts of salt clinging to the stone channels, whispering of an era when the fate of nations hinged on something as simple as a grain of Adriatic sea salt. The next time you casually shake salt onto your meal, remember, you're seasoning your food with the ghost of a maritime empire. In the misty highlands of Fujian and Zhejiang, where terraced tea gardens clung to mountains like emerald staircases, a humble leaf rewrote the rules of global commerce. Chinese tea, once a medicinal curiosity sipped by Tang Dynasty scholars, became the petroleum of the 18th century, a commodity so coveted that nations waged wars over it and sailors risked typhoons to shave days off delivery times. The South China Sea transformed into a liquid racetrack where sleek clipper ships with sails as sharp as knife edges sliced through waves, their holds packed with chests of oolong and pekoe that could make or break fortunes in London's auction houses. What made tea different from other luxuries was its perishability. Unlike spices that grew more valuable with age or silks that resisted decay, tea leaves lost their delicate aromas within months of harvest. This created a high-stakes game of maritime speed chess. British firms like Jardine Matheson paid bonuses for record-breaking runs. One legendary clipper, the Cutty Sark, once overtook a rival ship by sailing through the Sunda Strait's treacherous reefs under moonlight. The competition turned deadly when captains, desperate to catch favorable winds, overloaded their ships or ignored storm warnings. Wreckage from tea clippers still dots the Cape of Good Hope, their broken hulls testaments to the mantra, deliver or drown. Yet the tea trade's real power lay in its ripple effects. In Russia, camel caravans plodding the tea road from Beijing to Moscow inspired samovar culture, where sipping sessions became political acts, intelligentsia plotting reforms over steaming glasses of caravan-smoked lapsang souchong. Boston's harbor, stained brown by 342 chests of dumped tea in 1773, proved that taxation without representation could ignite revolutions. But the darkest chapter unfolded when Britain, facing a massive tea-induced trade deficit with China, flooded the country with opium from Bengal, addicting millions to bankroll their tea habit, a scheme so ruthless it triggered 2 opium wars and reshaped Asian geopolitics for a century. The clipper ships themselves were technological marvels. Designed with knife-like bows and acres of canvas, they could outrun naval frigates, the sea which set a record in 1849 by sailing from Hong Kong to New York in 74 days, a feat comparable to modern container ships. Their crews, a mix of seasoned British officers and exploited Chinese coolies, lived in floating hierarchies where a single spoiled tea crate could cost a sailor his wages. The ship's construction also reshaped American forests. Maine white pine and Georgia live oak were felled by the acre to meet British demand for hulls, sparking early conservation movements. Tea's cultural imprint was equally profound. The British afternoon tea ritual emerged because Duchess Anna of Bedford needed something to tide her over between the era's 2 meager meals, a snack time that became a national institution. In Japan, the Meiji Emperor used tea diplomacy to impress foreign dignitaries, serving Yuji matcha in gold leaf cups to signal Japan's sophistication. Even piracy adapted to the trade. South China sea raiders like Cheng Aisao's fleet extorted protection fees from tea junks, her ships often flying flags of multiple nations to confuse pursuers. The trade's collapse came from an unexpected source: botanical espionage. Scottish explorer Robert Fortune, disguised as a Mandarin official, smuggled live tea plants and skilled growers from China to Darjeeling in 1848, breaking China's monopoly. Within decades, Indian and Ceylon teas dominated global markets, their stronger flavors better suited to industrialized production. Yet echoes of the old trade linger in the clipper ship weather vanes atop New England homes, the blue and white Nanking cargo patterns on European china, and the fact that tea itself is a linguistic fossil. The Fujianese tea became the standard term worldwide, except where Cantonese cha traveled by land. The South China Sea's tea routes remind us that globalization's roots weren't planted by corporations or treaties, but by the universal human craving for a perfect cup of warmth, and the lengths we'll go to steal, smuggle, or sail our way to it. The decks of British clippers in the early 1800s didn't creak with tea or spices. They groaned under the weight of chests of opium, each one packed with sticky black resin that would unravel an empire. This wasn't trade as usual. It was economic warfare disguised as commerce, a calculated campaign where addiction became the ultimate profit engine. The British East India Company, backed by the Crown, turned India's poppy fields into factories of dependence, flooding China's ports with narcotics to reverse a trade deficit caused by Europe's insatiable thirst for tea. The staggering scale of this operation still chills the blood. By 1838, British merchants were smuggling over 1,400 tons of opium annually into China, enough to keep 4 million people in the grip of addiction, from laborers wasting away in Guangzhou's dens to scholars burning through family fortunes in Beijing's back alleys. What made this trade uniquely sinister was its veneer of legitimacy. British ships flying the Union Jack unloaded their contraband at offshore warehouses like Linton Island, where Chinese smugglers in fast, scramble boats dodged imperial patrols to ferry the drug ashore. The East India Company maintained deniability, outsourcing distribution to private country traders like Jardine Matheson, whose ledgers coolly recorded profits in pounds sterling while villages collapsed into dysfunction. Opium's chemistry amplified the devastation. Unlike alcohol, which metabolizes quickly, opium's derivatives linger in the body, creating users who needed ever larger doses just to function. By the time the Qing dynasty cracked down, entire provinces had bartered ancestral land for the next fix, and silver reserves hemorrhaged from China's treasury at a rate that threatened national bankruptcy. The geopolitical earthquake came in 1839, when Commissioner Lin Zexu made a stand at Human, confiscating and destroying 20,000 chests of British opium. His letter to Queen Victoria, appealing to moral decency, famously asked how England would feel if Chinese merchants peddled poison in London. The response: cannon fire. The First Opium War saw Britain's steam-powered Nemesis warship, a technological terror unlike anything China's wooden junks had faced, blasting through coastal defenses. The resulting Treaty of Nanjing wasn't just a surrender, it was a blueprint for colonial humiliation, forcing China to cede Hong Kong, open 5 treaty ports to foreign merchants, and accept extraterritoriality, a legal surrender that let British subjects operate above Chinese law. Yet the opium trade's darkest legacy was how it perverted global systems. The very ships that carried opium to China returned to London laden with silver, financing the Industrial Revolution's factories while Chinese peasants starved. In India, colonial administrators forced farmers to grow poppies instead of food, creating famines that killed millions. Even America got involved, with clippers like the Frolic smuggling Turkish opium into China to undercut British suppliers. The trade's tentacles stretched to Peru, where guano ships diverted to Macau to pick up human cargo coolies kidnapped to replace enslaved Africans on plantations. What's often forgotten is the resistance. Chinese pirates like Shi Yong led flotillas that attacked opium ships, while grassroots anti-opium societies sprang up among villagers who burned shipments in defiance. The irony, when Britain finally banned the opium trade in 1913, it wasn't due to moral reckoning, it was because Chinese domestic production had undercut their profits. Today, the ruins of old opium godowns in Kolkata and the faded ledgers in London's archives whisper a warning. When commerce divorces itself from conscience, the waves themselves can carry the poison. The opium routes didn't just move drugs, they revealed how easily trade's noble promise could twist into a weapon, leaving generations to pay the price. From the purple dyes of Phoenicia to the opium dens of Canton, these forgotten maritime trade routes are more than just footnotes in history. They're the invisible threads that stitched the world together long before the term globalization ever existed. Think about it. Every time you sprinkle pepper on your meal or sip a cup of tea, you're tasting the legacy of ancient sailors who braved uncharted waters to connect distant shores. These routes weren't just about moving goods, they were the original social networks carrying ideas, religions, and technologies that reshaped civilizations. The compass, the alphabet, even the concept of zero, all of them hitched rides on ships laden with silk and spices, proving that innovation has always been a passenger on the tides of trade. But here's the twist, these routes also reveal the dark undercurrents of human ambition. The same waves that carried Buddhist sutras to Japan also transported enslaved people across the Indian Ocean. The monsoon winds that filled the sails of Zhenghi's treasure fleets later propelled British opium clippers into China's harbors. Trade has never been neutral, it's a force that can build empires or break them, enrich cultures or exploit them. The lesson: connectivity comes with consequences, and the sea has always been both a giver and a taker. What's astonishing is how these ancient routes still echo today. Modern shipping lanes often trace the same paths as Phoenician traders, and the Straits of Malacca remain as strategically vital now as they were when Srivijaya kings taxed passing ships. Even our taste for luxury hasn't changed where Phoenicians hoarded Tyrian purple. We crave designer handbags and smartphones made with rare earth minerals. The players and products may differ, but the game remains the same. So as we scroll through our globally sourced gadgets and snack on internationally shipped treats, let's pause to remember the pioneers who made it possible. The navigators who steered by stars, the merchants who learned foreign tongues, and the countless unnamed souls whose labor and ingenuity built the world we know. Their stories remind us that history isn't just about kings and battles. It's about the quiet revolutions that happen in ship hulls and market stalls. If you've enjoyed this voyage through time, consider this your invitation to dive deeper. Hit like if you learned something new, subscribe for more untold stories, and drop a comment below about which trade route fascinated you most. Until next time, keep your curiosity as boundless as the ocean itself. Fair winds and following seas.